There's a moment, quiet, unannounced, when time stops feeling theoretical. Not dramatic, not cinematic. It doesn't arrive with a breakdown or a declaration. It arrives in small realizations. In noticing how fast years pass now. In realizing you're no longer imagining the future, you're negotiating with it. In understanding that some versions of your life aren't ahead of you anymore, they're behind you. And for women, this moment rarely gets named. Society talks about midlife crisis as something loud, reckless, visible. But for women, it's often the opposite. It's quiet. It looks like awareness, like inventory, like standing still long enough to realize how much of yourself has been shaped by adaptation rather than choice. It's the moment you see how much of your life has been spent adjusting, reading rooms, managing tone, softening edges, choosing safety over clarity. Not because you lacked ambition or courage, but because being direct wasn't always protected. Because being honest about who you were inside came with consequences. So the crisis doesn't show up as panic. It shows up as recognition. Recognition that time is finite. Recognition that energy is not endless. Recognition that you've been carrying versions of yourself that were never meant to last this long. And suddenly, the question isn't, what do I want to be? It's, who have I been allowed to be? This is where midlife actually begins. Not in regret, but in clarity. In seeing the distance between who you are and who you learned to present. In realizing that survival strategies have a lifespan. What kept you safe when you were younger can quietly become what confines you later. And the world doesn't prepare women for this reckoning, because women are expected to adapt gracefully, to age quietly, to be resilient without being disruptive, to carry change without letting it show. So when the realization comes that time is no longer generous, that identity has been negotiated for decades, that the future isn't a blank page, it doesn't explode, it settles. It asks harder questions. And the hardest one of all is this: if I stop performing who I've been, who am I allowed to become now? This is Cruz, and this week's episode is called The Crisis of You. For women, the reckoning doesn't stay abstract for long. Eventually, it moves into the body, and not gently. There's a point where your physical presence, something you've lived inside your entire life, suddenly becomes a subject of commentary, evaluation, correction. Your body, which once simply was, becomes something that's discussed as if there is nothing else to you at all. Something that's measured against time, against expectation, against a version of yourself that no longer exists. And what's rarely acknowledged is how disorienting that feels. Because women are taught early that their bodies are provisional, temporary, on loan, something to maintain, to manage, to keep acceptable. So when midlife arrives, it doesn't just bring awareness of time, it brings scrutiny. Subtle at first, a shift in how you're looked at, a change in what's praised and what's ignored. The quiet implication that something needs fixing. And the message is almost always the same: repair it. Not for comfort, not for health, but for relevance. So many women respond the only way they've been taught to. They try to restore what time has changed, to negotiate with aging, to make their bodies look like a version of themselves the world still recognizes. But here's the part no one prepares you for. Repair, when it's driven by fear, doesn't heal. It fragments. Because when a woman tries to fix her body without being allowed to grieve what's changing, she doesn't come out more whole. She comes out divided, watching herself from the outside, policing her reflection. becoming a project instead of a person. And the cruelty of it is this: the body was never the problem. The problem was that women were taught their worth lived there in the first place. So midlife becomes the moment when two truths collide: the truth that time has altered you, and the truth that the world was never built to let women age without punishment. And this is where the crisis deepens, because alongside the physical changes, there's another loss happening, quieter but just as destabilizing: language. The language you use to describe yourself no longer fits. The words that once felt safe, attractive, useful, desirable, acceptable, start to feel conditional. So women fall back on the skill they learned early. They encode, they speak sideways, they soften, they reference, they translate themselves into palatable forms, into humor, into culture, into self-deprecation, into silence. Because direct language, especially about the body, has always come with consequences. Too vain, too insecure, too honest, too much. So meaning is tucked into metaphor, into stories, into music, into fragments that feel safer than statements. And midlife is when that strategy finally reveals its cost. Because the body is changing, the identity is shifting, and the old survival language no longer holds. You can't encode your way out of a reckoning. You can't reference your way back into safety. And the real crisis isn't the body aging. It's realizing that you were never taught how to inhabit it without apology. This is the moment women aren't allowed to talk about. The moment when fixing stops working, when performance fails, when the mirror no longer offers reassurance. But at some point, something else begins to happen. It's harder to name than time, harder than watching the body become unacceptable. When meaning itself starts to fade away. The things that once felt motivating, achievement, progress, validation, momentum, don't land the way they used to. Not because you failed, not because you stopped trying, but because you can see them now. You can see how temporary they are, how conditional, how quickly they dissolve the moment you reach them. Goals that once felt like destinations now feel like moments you pass through without stopping. And at first, you assume this is a problem. You tell yourself you're ungrateful, burnt out, jaded, that you just need rest or novelty or a new version of the same pursuit. So you try to reignite the feeling. You set new goals, you raise the bar. You chase something adjacent, something that looks different enough to feel like change. But the spark doesn't come back. And that's when it starts to feel unsettling. Because the machinery of motivation is still there. You can function, you can perform, you can produce, but belief has quietly exited the room. You're doing things without believing in the meaning they're supposed to carry. Your life may look fine from the outside, responsible, competent, even successful by certain definitions. But inside there's a hollowing, a sense that you're completing tasks without being met by them. You don't feel sad, you don't feel dramatic, you feel unconvinced by your own life. This is the part people don't talk about. Midlife isn't always panic, it isn't always regret, it isn't always the fear of having nothing. Sometimes it's the realization that the things you worked so hard to build were never meant to hold the weight you placed on them. That productivity doesn't equal purpose. That validation doesn't equal belonging. That being needed doesn't mean being known. And once that illusion breaks, you can't force it back together. You can't convince yourself the way you used to. You can't unsee what you've seen. The narratives that once carried you forward lose their gravity, and you're left standing in a strange quiet. Not empty, but exposed. Because when borrowed meaning collapses, you're left with a question no one prepared you for. What actually matters to me now, without the script telling me what should? There's no roadmap for this moment, no ceremony, no language, no socially acceptable way to say, I don't know what I'm striving toward anymore. So you don't say it. You keep going, you keep functioning, you keep moving through your days with a sense that something fundamental has shifted, something irreversible. You're no longer becoming, you're no longer chasing, you're watching. Aware that the old motivators are gone, but the new ones haven't revealed themselves yet. And the quiet fear that maybe they never will. And that space, that in-between, is where the real crisis lives. Not in collapse, not in chaos, but in suspension. Something old has ended. Something new may never arrive. And for the first time, you're awake inside that gap, feeling the weight of an ending without a clear end. And then comes a moment that doesn't get talked about by anyone within the confines of the midlife reckoning. It isn't loud. It doesn't come with panic or collapse. It doesn't even feel like a crisis at first. It feels like stillness. The moment when you realize nothing is coming to meet you. No arrival, no reveal. No future version of yourself who finally understands what all of this was for. You finish something you thought would matter. You reach an age you once imagined as distant. You stand inside a life you worked hard to build, and nothing changes. No clarity drops in, no meaning settles, no voice arrives to tell you what comes next. For a long time, we're taught to believe that meaning will show up later, that identity will solidify, that eventually life will explain itself. Midlife is when that promise quietly disappears, and that's when the fear sets in. Not because something went wrong, but because nothing did. You realize you've been waiting for a moment that was never scheduled, and suddenly you're left alone with awareness. No instructions, no applause, no external authority to tell you who you are now supposed to be. Just choice and responsibility, and the terrifying understanding that no one is coming to name your life for you. This is where the crisis actually lives, not in wanting something new, but in realizing there is no next chapter written in advance. That's why the film The Truman Show has always stayed with me, because it understood this before I ever did. There's no explosion at the end, no triumphant music, no guarantee of happiness waiting on the other side. Just a man standing in front of a door. Everything familiar is behind him. Everything uncertain is ahead of him. And for the first time in his life, no one is telling him what to do. That's the moment, not the escape, the pause before it, the second when the illusion collapses and the weight of authorship settles in. Because once you see the set, once you recognize the pattern, once the old meanings stop working, you don't get to go back. You don't get comfort. You get the scariest responsibility of all. Responsibility for yourself, without the illusions of time or dreams or wants, without the somedays, without the possibilities of infinity. Midlife isn't about reinvention. It's about standing in front of that door at the end of the Truman Show and realizing no one else is going to open it for you. No one is coming to explain this. No one is arriving to make sense of it all. This is the moment where meaning stops being given and becomes something you have to choose. As we turn to give that final wave to the audience of our life, in that pause, a realization settles in. The door only opens one way, and there is no return. And what waits on the other side isn't freedom, it's you. Please check your favourite bookstores worldwide for my novel, The Zephyrus Chronicles Rebirth. The highly anticipated sequel, Cantera, arrives this February. This is Cruz reminding you to stay close to the echo. Bye for now.